The covenant God made with Abraham was personal.
The Israelite covenant was communal. Now, you'll be sure to understand what I mean by this. God made a covenant with Abraham, who's one guy. There was no need for somebody to be looking over his shoulder and supervising what it was that he did. It was a man, his family, their own personal relationship and arrangement with God. When it came to Israel, the covenant that was made, or the deal that was cut with Israel as they came out of Egypt, was made with a peoples, a nation, if you will, of peoples, hundreds of thousands of them, who had to then be able to relate to one another and work together within the framework of the law of God. And this made requirements, administrative requirements, that went way above and beyond anything that anyone had experienced before. The very fact that the covenant was a community, or covenant was with a community, required an administration. And this was entirely new. Now remember, our purpose is education. To paint in the background so you will know when somebody is trying to slip something by on you. There are a lot of doctrinal papers on the covenants floating around, and for the most part, they are grinding one doctrinal axe or the other. The covenants are one of the primary approaches to attempting to get rid of the Ten Commandments and to get rid of, in particularly, the fourth commandment, as everyone knows by now. So our objective is a depth of understanding on the subject, and understanding that we can use to test ideas that come our way. Now, it's axiomatic that any written law requires an oral law to go with it. That may or may not be immediately apparent to you. But the fact is, take, for example, the words, the law says that you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. What does the word booth mean? One of the primary functions of oral law in Jewish tradition is to maintain the meaning of words, so that when the law speaks of something, you will know what it's talking about. Oral tradition is there to help you understand what that means. When the law says, thou shalt not do any work, what does that mean? When the law says you shall not do any servile work, what does that distinction mean? You'll have to search pretty hard through the Bible to find your indications, and these are the kinds of things that oral tradition, or the oral law as it's called, maintains down through time. At the personal level, each person has to make numerous decisions about obedience to God. Not merely whether to obey, although we have that decision to make as well, but what actually constitutes obedience. The Scripture says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. Well, now, there are some of you ladies here who probably would consider, some of you gentlemen especially, who would consider making the bed on the Sabbath day work. And therefore you probably would say, no, I won't do that. I'll do that tomorrow morning. There are some people who would consider the washing of dishes on the Sabbath day work. Other people would think that it's not nearly as restful to leave the dishes in the sink as it is to go ahead and wash them and put them away, and then your mind goes at rest. Now, these are decisions which people make all the time. And we can sit around and differ on these decisions, and we can offer our reasons why, in my judgment, I would do this, in your judgment, you would not. This is one of the things Paul's driving at in Romans 14 when he says each of us has to be persuaded in our own mind. Now, this is a distinction that is made of a covenant or an arrangement or an administration of law that has to do with, the decisions that we make. They are personal under the relationship we live in today. So at the personal level, we all have these decisions to make. Now, there's a desire, and I guess it's natural in people, to have everything spelled out for us so that we know precisely where our boundaries are. But the problem is, there is no book that could be written that could cover all the questions you and I would have about what's best to do in this situation, what's best to do in that situation. Life is too complicated for that. So what the law of God does is lay down basic parameters, gives us illustrations, gives us judgments on past circumstances having to do with the law, puts this in our hands and said, here, this is a light to your feet, a lamp to your path, so that you can make your way around the obstacles of life and not fall down and hurt yourself. This is the idea of the law of God. What we call the Old Covenant was a new deal in its day. There had never been anything like it before. It created a new administration. Now, we should be quite familiar in our society with the meaning of and the effect of a change of administration. Every time we change presidents, we get one. And when we change president and party in the White House, we get a bigger one, don't we? Everyone knows. New president, new party, comes walking into Washington, sets up his transition headquarters, begins to appoint cabinet members. Everybody knows a new administration is in town. Now, we have the same laws, we have the same Constitution, we have the same courts, but we got a new executive. And if you think that doesn't matter in the application of laws to our lives, you haven't been paying attention. Because the people who are involved with government know it. And it scares them a little bit sometime when a new administration comes into town, because they realize that the same laws can be administered more strictly or less strictly. They can be administered tightly or they can be ignored entirely by an administration. The Justice Department can simply look at the evidence of a crime and decide it's not worth prosecuting in their sole subjective discretion. Or they can decide, which may be even more frightening, that it is worth prosecuting and in their sole subjective discretion, which is going to cost somebody a lot of time, a lot of money, and maybe some parts of their freedom. The battles that are fought over cabinet nominations reveal the concern over the ways the law will be administered. And at the time we're studying this today, we've got this battle going on in Washington now. Actually, it's only just beginning. The opening shots have not even really been fired yet, and everybody is starting to get very excited about this nominee or that nominee and how this person is going to approach the problems of government as they come to them. So we all understand, hopefully, that a change in administration has a great deal to do with the way the law begins to impact the lives of American people. Some of us really don't feel much of it. Other people feel more of it, and the more people are going to feel of it, and the more they're going to experience of it, the more concerned they're going to be about the appointments that a new president makes going into office. The battles over Supreme Court nominees reveal a great deal of concern over the way the Constitution will be interpreted. And you'll want to watch that as it takes place, because it's an excellent illustration of the concern people have with the same laws, same Constitution, same structure of government, how different things can become if certain changes take place, both in cabinet, in administration posts, and in presidency, and in the judiciary. And so these are things that we can concern ourselves about. Now, when we come to the Bible, and try to understand this, there's an interesting passage in Paul that illustrates this fact, I think, in that Paul realized distinctly that he and the others were part of a new administration. Now, it's hard for people to get their mind around this because we've been trained or taught certain ways and our minds run down certain channels, and we don't look at these things in the eyes in which the people who originally read them look at them. But Paul clearly understands that we're not dealing, it's a lot like our situation. He's not dealing with a bunch of new laws. You're not dealing with a new structure. What you're dealing with is a new administration of the old Constitution and of the old laws, and consequently different administrations. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, Do we begin again to commend ourselves? Or do we need, like others, epistles of commendation to you or letters of commendation from you? Is it really necessary that I walk in here with a set of credentials that I've gotten from somebody else? Or if I'm going from here somewhere else, do I need you to give me a set of credentials to go to somebody else? The answer is obviously no. He says, you are our epistle or our credentials, written in our heart, known and read of men. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, administered, notice the word ministered, and the way in which the word ministered or in ministry is used in this passage, you will understand it probably better if you look at it in terms of administration rather than in terms of a religious ministry like my ministry. He says, you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, administered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart. And such trust we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Our sufficiency is of God. Who, and here's the crunch, who has also made us able ministers or administrators of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, there's an interesting little thing about words here. The King James translators, who has made us able ministers. The people in England, what would in this country be called cabinet members, are in England called ministers of department. The members of Tony Blair's cabinet are the Ministry for Health, the Ministry for this, the Ministry for that. In our country, it's the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, and so forth. They have different names. But they even have what's called a minister without portfolio. That is, he's a member of the cabinet, but he doesn't have a department. He's there more in an advisory capacity. So the translators, King James translators, when they use the term minister, you have to consider this is a job of a servant, perhaps a civil servant. The church is the equivalent of a civil servant in Paul's case. But he is an administrator. He's using the term here of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. For if the administration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses, for the glory of his countenance which was to be done away. Now, this goes on here, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But before I go any further with that, I want to explain this briefly, this ministration of death written and engraven in stones. The reason I do this is because there is a common assumption on many people's part. They make two mistakes in this passage of Scripture. They assume that the ministration of death written and engraven in stones is the Ten Commandments. It's not. And secondly, they assume that the ministration of death written and engraven in stones was done away with, which it was not. But first of all, let's understand what he's talking about here. Moses is in I needed a scripture reference here, and I didn't put the book in my scripture reference, so I'll have to leave it for you to look this up. I believe it's Deuteronomy 27:1, but it may not be. Take a look for me if you would, and we'll pass the word around to the others. It's either Deuteronomy 27:1 or Numbers 27:1, possibly Exodus 27:1. I don't know, I'm not sure. But it's 27:1. I got that. Moses with the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, Keep all the commandments I command you this day. It shall be on the day when you pass over Jordan unto the land which the Lord your God has given you, that you shall set you up great stones and plaster them with plaster. Now, that's a strange thing to do, except which one? It's Deuteronomy 27. That's what I thought it was. Okay, Deuteronomy 27:1. You shall plaster them with plaster, but the reason you do this is so you can write on them. You write on them all the words of this law. When you are passed over, you may go into the land which the Lord your God has given you, a land that flows with milk and honey, as the God of your fathers has promised you. Therefore it shall be, when you have gone over Jordan, that you shall set up these stones which I command you this day in Mount Ebal. You shall plaster them with plaster. You shall build an altar of stones. Then he says this, you shall not lift up any iron tool upon them. In other words, you couldn't just take big stones and take a chisel and chisel the words into it, because they were not allowed to lift up an iron tool in any way on the altar, anything having to do with God. They weren't supposed to be doing any graven images, and the Ten Commandments, which were written in tables of stone, were not written with an iron tool. They were written with the finger of God himself. Now, I want to stop here just for a moment, because I think this is an important concept. In the Bible, there is a conscious, deliberate avoidance of images, and particularly of graven images. We live in a time, in an age, where images are everything. The images that we see on television all the time convey so much information to us that it can oftentimes be overwhelming. It actually influences public policy. But the way in which God wanted to reveal himself to us was not in images. He wanted to reveal himself to us in words. Because words contain information, words imply logical structure. In other words, the revelation of God was a revelation of words, logic, information, not merely of images. And this is, I think, an important distinction, so that the prohibition, the strict and rigid prohibition against doing any carving with iron tools on stones, is designed to get rid of any imagery where God is concerned, so that the revelation of God is a revelation in words, which is why Jesus is called the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So that we're not dealing with images. We're dealing with, in particularly, the Word. So in other words, you set up these stones, you plaster them with plaster, and you build an altar. He says, you shall build upon the altar of your God with whole stones. You shall offer burnt offerings thereupon to the Lord your God. You shall offer peace offerings and eat there and rejoice before the Lord your God. And you shall write upon the stones all the words of this law plainly. Now, we're not here dealing with the Ten Commandments. We're dealing with commandments, statutes, judgment. We're dealing with the book of the covenant. We're dealing with a broad variety of administrative matters as well as basic legal matters that had to be written on these stones. Now, returning back to Paul in 2 Corinthians 3, he says, if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, shall not the administration of the Spirit be even more glorious? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more does the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excels. Now, Paul's really very awkward here. What he's saying is this. When Moses came with this law, his face shone with a glory. That glory was going to fade from Moses' face. We're not talking about the fading away of the law. We're talking about the fading away of the glory of Moses' countenance in this particular situation. But the glory that he had coming down, even though it was bright, is dimmed by comparison to the glory of the revelation that God has for us in Jesus Christ. That's all he's saying. If that which is done away was glorious, and again, it's not talking about the law being done away, it's talking about the doing away or the fading away of the glory from Moses' countenance, much more that which remains is glorious. Now, seeing that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech, and not like Moses, who put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. Now, why on earth people assume from this that it's the law that was abolished is not clear to me. Because it's very plain from the text. He said he put a veil over his face, so the children of Israel could not steadfastly look at what was being abolished. Well, the law was not behind that veil. Moses' face was behind that veil. The man, Moses, who, by the way, was the chief administrator of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant administrator, the man in charge, it was one man, a human being. In their mind, but he says their minds were blinded, for in this day remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil, not the Old Testament's done away, the veil is done away. These people look at the Old Testament, understand it at a certain level, but there's a level beyond which they just simply cannot go. Even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when their heart, shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now, the Lord is that Spirit. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed in the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Now, the Old Covenant was an administration of death, in that it not only had laws, it had penalties. Now, we're in a different situation in the modern world as Christians. You know, we have a set of laws that God has revealed to us. We don't commit adultery, we don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. But there is not in this life the penalties that are imposed by God, all unless he comes along to chastise us at some point in time. But in most cases, I think most people in the world receive no chastisement from God. They merely receive the results of the things that they do in the flesh. But the Old Testament law had specific, imposed, physical, civil penalties with it. And remember, this is a community that is being administered by this covenant, not an individual. And so there are problems. And not only that, it's a community that is camped and is on the road in the wilderness. Now, there were different administrative problems here in the wilderness from what they would encounter once they were in the land. And there's a really classic example of this in Numbers. And once again, I fear that I have neglected to put the chapter in this time, although I have the particular passage of Scripture. It's in Numbers, and it's verse 27 of the chapter that is in question. He says, If any soul sin through ignorance, and you'll have a little difficulty looking this up in the concordance. If any soul sin through ignorance, then he shall bring a goat of the first year for a sin offering. Now, in this passage, a clear distinction is going to be made between sins of ignorance and presumptuous sins. The word for ignorance basically in the Hebrew means a mistake. And that really is the category of most of the sins that we as human beings get involved in. They are mistakes. They're things that maybe we knew better, maybe we shouldn't have done, but at any rate, we have come to the place to where we realize, what is it? My number's 15? Okay, Numbers 15:27. We realize that we made a mistake. Now, there is, however, another kind of sin that's mentioned in this chapter. He says if a person makes a sin through ignorance or mistake, a human weakness sin, let's call it, the priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sins ignorantly when he sins by ignorance before the Lord, to make an atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. You shall have one law for him that sins through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel and for the stranger that sojourns among them. But the soul that does anything presumptuously, the Hebrew expression is with a high hand. And that's a very good description. You know, when somebody sins with a high hand, whether he be born in the land, whether he be a stranger, the same reproaches the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among his people. Now, you can kind of see the difference, can't you? A person commits a sin through weakness and through forgetfulness or through, ignorance or what have you. This soul can come and make his offering, be forgiven, and be restored to the people of Israel. But when someone sins with a high hand, when he gets in your face with his sin, he is reproaching not just man, not just the covenant, he's reproaching God himself. He shall be cut off because he has despised the word of the Lord. Notice, he doesn't just ignore it, he despises the word of the Lord, hates that kind of government, and his soul shall be cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him. Now, what's interesting about this is that this passage is not a historical passage, but a historical incident now comes into it. It's a passage of laws. And in the middle of it, it has a historical incident which is introduced as an illustration of the presumptuous, high-handed sin. While the children of Israel were in the wilderness. If you underline in your Bible, you might want to underline that phrase because it illustrates the seriousness of the situation we are in. It also implies that the same sanctions might not have been applied once they were in the land. He said, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation. They put him in ward because it was not declared what should be done to him. This was not yet known. What do we do about this? What's the enforcement, the penalty? The Lord said to Moses, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, a lot of people look at that, and they assume, I think from this, that this severity of penalty would be imposed in all circumstances and all generations. However, the context of it has to do with ignorant sins, sins of weakness, or presumptuous sins. Supposing, for example, that you were in a situation in the wilderness and a cold front came through that absolutely no one expected. And there is no heat in the place. And a man's wife is giving birth to a child. And her health could be in danger because of this. This man goes out, gathers sticks on the Sabbath to come in and build a fire. Is he going to be stoned for the same way someone who goes out and gathers sticks on the Sabbath presumptuously or with a high hand or in your face and says, you can't tell me what to do? Is he going to be treated the same way? I think not. There was a judgment that had to be made concerning what to do about this man. It was an administrative judgment. So hence the concept that this was the administration of death. Now, Paul says that's not what we've got in this situation. What we have is the administration of the Spirit. In Exodus chapter 18, I'm sorry, I'm passed over a couple of things I want to say here before I go to chapter 18. I think that once the people were scattered in the land, physical punishment of this kind of sin was no longer practical. There was, in many cases, you're not even going to know what the guy's doing. But in the wilderness, where everybody's camped close together, and where your neighbor's tent is an arm's reach away, and you can see up and down rows of tents and see what people are doing all over the place, and everybody knows what everybody else is doing, a sin like this is a problem. Once the people are in the land, scattered throughout the land, it no longer is the kind of problem. It was a flaunting, frankly, of the administration in place at the time that created the problem. The church has no obligation to punish this kind of sin. In any case, we cannot administer death. But it is a fact. It is not an obligation of the church to enforce any part of the law of God. This is a major difference. The administration of the Old Covenant was different from the administration of the New. And it is whenever the church begins to enforce the law of God upon its members that the first paving stones, actually, the groundwork for cults, are laid. When churches get rules, churches enforce the rules instead of granting to people the freedom to obey God or disobey God as they choose to do. That's where the church gets into problems. Now, it doesn't mean that the church can't exercise discipline. But in the case in 1 Corinthians 5, where the man was found having sexual intercourse, I guess, with his father's wife, not necessarily his mother, but his stepmother, and they didn't know what to do about that, Paul told them to give that man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. In other words, the church didn't themselves do anything to the man. Whatever it meant to turn him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, simply, I guess, meant for the church to remove the divine protection, the spiritual protection that God gives to all of us, and I would gather probably to remove him from their midst. But this was not a matter of enforcement of the law in terms of punishment. The church did not give people stripes. They didn't make a person lie down and beat him like they could in Old Testament times. The church could not stone a man to death. The church could not take that kind of physical sanction against an individual. All they could do is turn them over to Satan or withhold fellowship from them, and that was about the end of it as far as the church is concerned. And when churches get out into making rules, they have the law of God, they try to enforce it, and then they make their own rules like fences around the law of God. When you get into those areas, they're heading in the direction of becoming a cult. Now, to understand a little bit more the development of administration in the Old Testament, I'd like you to come back to Numbers 18 and verse 13. This time I've got the book, the chapter, and the verse. Numbers 18, verse 13. I usually pull all this material out of, from the computer and paste it into my notes so that I don't have to be thumbing back and forth through the Bible. This time I was hoisted by my own petard and got a little too quick. Exodus 18. Exodus. Did I say Numbers last time? Then I didn't have book, chapter, and verse. I had chapter and verse, all right. Exodus 18. It came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning to the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, "What is this thing? What in the world are you doing? Why are you sitting up here alone, and all the people stand by you from morning to evening?" He wanders in here, and here's Moses sitting in a seat, and a line of people struck out to the horizon nearly, waiting to see him. And Jethro walks up and sees this and says, "What on earth are you doing here?" And Moses said, "Well, the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come to me, and I judge between one another, and I make them to know the statutes of God and His laws." Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? And again, I said earlier that every written law requires an oral law. It wasn't that these people didn't know what the statutes and all that of God were. The problem was that you can never, ever get everything that might be decided written down. You just can't do it. I mean, you fill law libraries with the decisions of courts, and there are still new stuff that come up from time to time that people have to have decided by the courts. Moses was not merely the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he was the only Justice of the Supreme Court. And so on, and he was also the district court, the local courts, and everything else. He was the only court there was. So if there's a question about the law, questions about the observance of the law, the administration of the law, they had to queue up, come down to Moses, and ask them about it. Moses' father-in-law said, "What you're doing is not smart. You will surely wear away, you and the people that are with you, because they're going to be standing in this line for a while, and they're going to say, 'Phooey to this, I'm not going to stand here. I'll go sort this thing out myself,'" which might not have been too bad anyway. He said, "If you'll surely wear away. It's too heavy for you. You are not able to perform it yourself alone. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God shall be with you. Be you for the people toward God, that you may bring the causes to God. And you shall teach them ordinances and laws, and show them the way they must walk and the work they must do. Then you have to provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, who hate covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. This is the first classic example of the creation of a pyramid style of governance, And it makes a lot of sense, that I got to go to one guy that 10 other people go to. And if he can't answer the question, he goes to the guy above him, and there are only 10 of them that can go to him with questions. So he's not burdened down unnecessarily, and he can see them quickly. My question can be kicked right up, very quickly to Moses if it has to go all the way to Moses, or I can get an answer short of that. And so they created a natural little appeal system in Israel, in a pyramid style of judgment, whereby they could get decisions made on the hard questions of law from time to time. It would be questions like, how many dishes can you wash on the Sabbath day? Because, culture is different. But it's that style of question. What do I do about this problem? I have an idea. In many cases, they told them, well, make up your own mind. That's nothing we have to concern ourselves with. Anyway, he said, let them judge the people at all seasons. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring to you. Every small matter they shall judge. It will be easier for yourself, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God command you so, then you'll be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all he said, and a pyramid style of government was set up. Now, there's something really interesting about this particular structure, that while God seems to accept it, visions of the judges down through time as interpreted by the teachers, the sages of Israel. And so all of this body of information, all of this body of judicial decisions and all that stuff builds up down through time. And in it, there are a lot of contradictory decisions, a lot of wrong decisions, a lot of judgments that went in the wrong directions. But those judgments are not written in the book. They're a part of oral tradition. And because they're an oral tradition, and because they are made by fallible human beings, they do not carry the weight that the written law does. But they are of great value sometimes in understanding how things were applied to the written law at other times in history. And this is something which it's important. And in fact, you will even find some judgments of this kind that have made their way into the written law, and they are there. We may have time to go to one of them today before we get through, but it's an illustration of the kind of thing that happens when we come up against a problem that the law does not specify what we are to do. And so we have to decide, where are we going to go from here? A judgment is then handed down. In one case, for example, a judgment is handed down by God himself as to what to do about it. That goes into the written law. And therefore, it stays there generation after generation for us to understand how God applied the written law, the original law, to the circumstances of the time in which people were living and in these situations. So he had to do all these things and set this up. Now, even that turned out not to be adequate, because later in Numbers 11, Moses has become burdened down again by the tremendous burden of carrying forward with these people. And it's not hard to understand how it could be so, because no matter how you structure this thing, an awful lot of people were still coming to Moses with problems, difficulties, and so forth, and he was being burdened down by it severely. In Numbers 11, you find the situation where he complains to God about this, and a new solution is developed for it. And it's an interesting one, I must say. Moses says in Numbers 11, verse 14, I'm not able to bear this people alone. It's just too heavy for me. If you're going to make me do this, kill me, I pray, out of hand, if I've found favor in your sight. Don't let me have to see this, my wretchedness, anymore. And the Lord said to Moses, here's what we're going to do. Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people, and officers over them. Now, I'll just pause for a moment, a little sidelight here. Do you have any idea how these people actually came to be elders of Israel? And any idea how they were chosen? How they actually came about to be selected? How they came to be officers over the people of Israel? Because there really isn't much here to tell us anything about this. We know that perhaps those captains of tens and captains of 50 and so forth turned out to be officers over the people of Israel. I don't know. But God actually says, you gather to me 70 men whom you know to be elders of Israel. So again, it's a direction by God for him to use his own mind, to use common sense, to exercise his judgment, to pick these people. and bring them to the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with you. And I will come down and talk with you there. I will take some of the Spirit that is upon you, and I will put it upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you bear it not yourself alone. Now, what's interesting, this particular group of people were going to be empowered by God to do this thing, whereas the original captains of 50, captains of 1,000, there was nothing like this involved. It was able men, wise men, who were not covetous, who wouldn't be making decisions based upon how much money was in it for them. In other words, they were all human virtues and human abilities that we look for to see to it that these people could do this. This time, we're not only going to look for that caliber of man, but God is going to empower them with the Spirit. Now, I won't take the time to read the remainder of the story, but the remainder of the story is interesting all by itself. These people were selected and told to come up to the tabernacle and be there with Moses. They all came but one. 69 of them were there. One was still back in the camp. The Holy Spirit fell on these men on that day, on all of them that were at the tabernacle, and it also fell on the guy who was out in the camp and hadn't made it up to the tabernacle for whatever reason. Those 70 men, once they were designated, wherever they were, the Spirit of God came upon them. And everybody knew, by whatever manifestation it was, that these men were now empowered by God to do the same sort of thing Moses had done before. But this time, there were 70 of them, not in multiples of 12 like the tribes of Israel. And the most 70 is 10 times 7, God's number, so that He picks them out for Himself and does it the way He wants to do it. Now, when they entered the land, they were to have a different system of administration, apparently, once they entered the land. Some aspects of this appear to have remained, but nevertheless, the requirements of the wilderness wanderings, because of their closeness, were different from their requirements once they were into the land, and they were segregated. When a lot of the things that you did wrong in your life had no impact on your neighbor whatsoever. You know, because your neighbor is over the hill and through the woods and down yonder, and whatever you do here in your local community or in your family or your own personal circumstances doesn't have much effect. So the necessities of judgment and of administration under the Old Covenant were different in this way. So he says in Deuteronomy 16, verse 18, what they were to do. He said, "Judges and officers shall you make you in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you." Now, there were cities. Cities of refuge, for example, were named within all these. And in all those cities, the gate was the place of judgment or the place of administration. He said, "Judges and officers shall you make you in all your gates which the Lord your God gives you." Now, there's no instructions here that I know of whereby God tells Israel how they are to make for themselves judges. And, it's a human process. It's not a divinely ordained process. It's not men that God is picking out. We know that because some of them turned out to be terrible leaders in Israel. And some of them turned out to be, whenever God did pick one, He turned out to be a great leader. "Judges and officers shall you make you in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, throughout all your tribes. They shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not twist judgment. You shall not respect persons. You shall not take a gift, because a gift blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shall you follow, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God shall give you." So they had a responsibility for establishing a system of judgment that was fair and honest, impartial, that did not take advantage of people for money, and that theoretically they would not make their decisions based upon political alliances and who would be favored by the decisions that they might be making. Actually, I really think that down to our day, a lot of our system of government are adaptations of many things that they read in the Old Testament about the way in which things were done. That, some of these things some of the things we do may have come from Greece, but I really think a great deal of them came from biblical injunctions, because the people who set up this country, the founding fathers, were men very cognizant of the Bible in general and of the Old Testament in particular. Now, there's one very important passage in the Old Testament that you must take into consideration. It's Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. In verse 8. "If there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment." Now, who got to decide whether it's too hard for you or not? You did, obviously. Otherwise, who else knows? If you arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and get you up into the place which the Lord your God should choose. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge that shall be in those days. In other words, whatever system you have got in place, priest, Levite, judge in your community, you shall go up to there, and they will show you the sentence of judgment. And you shall do according to the sentence which they of that place, the Lord your God, shall show you. You shall observe to do according to all that they inform you, according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach you, according to the judgment which they shall tell you. You shall not decline from the sentence which they shall show you to the right hand or to the left. How serious is this? Well, the man that will do presumptuously and will not listen to the priest that stands to minister before the Lord your God or to the judge, that man shall die. And you'll put away evil from among yourselves if you do this. You won't have a lot of nonsense going on. And the people shall hear and fear and do no more presumptuously. Now, what's the significance of this? The significance of this is that if two guys had a dispute between them, as a problem they couldn't solve, they would get themselves down to the priest or the Levite or the judge, whoever was in the position to render decision in their venue at that time and that place. And they would present their case to this person. The person who heard the case had to render righteous judgment, and in the process he had to teach them from the law the basis for his decision that he was making. He could not, this may sound familiar to you, he could not make law. He could only interpret or explain law. It was all his job was. Now, once he has rendered that decision, it becomes what in law, is called a precedent, and it goes into the books. It's written down. It becomes a part of the background of the interpretation of the law. And if you go looking back through Talmuds and Mishnahs, what you will find in Jewish literature are the rather confused and sometimes confusing results of generation after generation after generation of decisions that were made by rabbis and others in positions of responsibility, sometimes based on parts of the law that in the early days truly were oral. Up until the time of about 200 years after Christ, all this was oral. None of it was written down. In fact, it was prohibited, I think, to be written down, if my memory serves me. Men spent their lives memorizing this stuff, sitting in front of a sage who repeated it to them over and over again, and interpreting and so forth, internalizing the law of God as interpreted by the sages down through time. And so finally, at one time, they made a terrible mistake. They decided to write it all down in the Mishnah. And then, of course, there were more interpretations that have taken place down through generations in the Talmud. And what you have there are the interpretations of the law that were made over time. Some very early interpretations of the law are actually included in your written Bible because of situations they encountered when God was still willing to talk to them. And when God would actually hear their case, give them an answer, and that answer would be written down because it came right down from God. And so you have a judgment of God passed on statutes that were already in existence. So these things were done. So my point here is that the decisions that were rendered by the judges were fully backed up by God, all the way to the death penalty. And remember, you didn't have to ask in the first place. If you guys can sort it out between yourselves, don't come down here. But if you come down here, and if the judge decides, it takes on all the force of the written law of God for you. Right there. It's binding, if you want to use that word. It wasn't binding until the judge decided it. But when the judge decided it, it's binding. And it can be maybe narrowly binding, or it can maybe be broadly binding. The Supreme Court makes narrow decisions and they make broad decisions. And so did the judges of old make narrow decisions and broad decisions. The decision might be a decision that was made between the boundary line between you and another guy's property. And that decision applied to you guys and wouldn't really make much difference to anybody else except for somebody that purchased your property after that period of time. And so on it would go. There are other laws, for example, Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, which have to do with the whole community as to how they were to deal with situations of divorce. We won't go there right now. I just will mention it to you in passing as one that you can study. This is a broad ruling because they had to decide what are we going to do about women who are being divorced from their husbands. We know nobody was supposed to ever get a divorce in the first place. But whenever a woman played the harlot and committed sin, her husband found out about it, and he didn't want her in his bed any longer. He didn't want to, stone her to death either, which he didn't have to do by the law. He could do, but didn't have to. What are we supposed to do? And the judgment was rendered, well, give her a writing of divorcement and send her away, and we'll allow her to marry another guy, but she can't come back to the first guy. This was a broad judgment rendered by God, instead not just by a judge, and which did apply across a broad front in ancient Israel. and was written down, therefore not one jot nor one tittle of it shall pass till heaven and earth pass away, that God's judgment in this matter, whenever a similar situation arises, should hold, even down to the modern world. So, this is the way it was done. They rendered a decision. The decision took on all the force of law. Now note the difference in the New Testament. Matthew 16 and verse 18. Jesus says to Peter, I say unto you that you're Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, first of all, let's understand what he's about to say is later on spoken to all 12, not just to Peter. But he says this, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. This is the New Testament equivalent of Deuteronomy 17:8 and the verses following there that I just read to you a moment ago. So that whenever something comes to the apostles and they decide it, it takes on all the force of law. They are not allowed to write law any more than an Old Testament judge could write law. But they could interpret the law for the church, which they did in Acts 15 when they made certain decisions regarding circumcision and other things for the Gentiles, remember? So they could make interpretations based upon the law. Their interpretations took on all the force of law for the circumstances in which those decisions were made. Now, it's possible in later generations a decision made by first century apostles might not be valid any longer because of certain things that might change. And so we would have to look at those things as a church and consider what we were supposed to do. But again, as individuals, we do not have the authority to write law. We only have the authority to interpret the law as it applies to our life today. Well, you can't rewrite the Sabbath law, but you can decide whether you're going to wash 2 dishes or 1 dish, or whether a half a dozen plates is too much. Those decisions you're allowed to make for yourself within the law. But again, this is a personal judgment. You're not writing law. You're interpreting law. Although there is no Old Testament-style enforcement in the New Testament, there is a need for judgment in difficult matters. And that judgment, just like it was in the Old Testament, is binding. And it takes on all the force of the written law for the circumstances in which that judgment was rendered. And that last phrase is very important. That judgment has to be, though, according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach you. In other words, you've got to cite the law. You've got to explain the application of the law. You can't just write new law. For not allowed. They had no authority to make new law, only to interpret the existing law. And here's where a lot of people come a cropper over the question of law in the Bible. There are 2 cousins. One of them is named legalism. The other is named literalism. And people who try to tackle the law in the Bible always, fall over these particular things. And they forget that the law is a light to your feet and a lamp to your path. It is not shackles and chains. And there's a very huge difference between these 2 things. They may try to resolve it by complicated arguments about covenants, but I will tell you the answer does not lie there when you run into these problems. It lies in the responsibility of the man of God to judge righteous judgment. That is, he tries to interpret the intent of the Spirit of law, and he acts to please God. You understand? You for yourself and for your family, you interpret the intent and the spirit of the law, and you act in such a way as to please God. That is your objective. You do not do so to worship the letter of the law or to please men or to impress some people who are passing a bunch of rules. This is not required in the New Testament. Jesus said, think not, Matthew 5, verse 17. Think not I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot nor one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till everything has come to pass. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, if he's in a position to judge, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, unless your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, that's an odd thing when you think about it. What in the world does he mean by that? I'll tell you what he means by it. He means that the interpretations of the law, the judgments that the scribes and the Pharisees have been making, are wrong. And your righteous judgments are going to have to be better than theirs if you're going to get into the kingdom of God. You're going to have to look at the law of God. You're going to have to weigh it in the balances. You're going to have to act to please God, not to please yourself, not to please some religious party, a religious organization. You do that, and your righteousness will certainly exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, once it's written in the law, Jesus said, not one jot nor one tittle. Not one jot or one tittle will ever go away, not even the commandment regarding presumptuous sin. The difference, though, is administration. They had a different administration from ours. Their administration was to enforce the law in that community. Ours is not. Ours is to apply the spirit of the law in mercy. And it's very different for us. Not a different law, mind you. Same law, but administered differently. Jesus said in Matthew 11 and verse 28, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and you'll find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The problem he had with the scribes and the Pharisees that they were laying all kinds of heavy burdens on people when they were called upon to make decisions. And in many cases, they were making decisions that were not even theirs to make. And they were causing people to have to do these things, and they were burdens which they themselves took the liberty not to obey. Now, you see how this would happen easily. They come to you in judgment, and you listen to all their case, and you apply a very strict standard to these people and send them away. When you yourself face a situation in life, you apply a much more liberal standard than they do. You won't lift the kind of burden that you lay upon these people. And I think this is not uncommon with human judges who have two standards. One for the people that come to them in judgment, and one when they're judging themselves, that they cut themselves just a whole lot more slack than they do anybody else. And that's what Jesus is talking about on this occasion. Now, there's another little occasion where Jesus gave an illustration which tends again to drive the legalists up the wall. It's in Matthew 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck the ears of corn and eat them as they went, which, by the way, the law permitted even as walking through somebody else's field. That is, it permitted you to eat what was there at the time. You couldn't harvest it and take it off with you. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath day." And he said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when he was hungry?" Now think about it. These guys were hungry, and so they plucked some ears of grain and ate them as they went through here. Haven't you heard what David did when he was hungry, and they who were with him? How he entered into the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priests. Now, I want you to think very carefully about this, because many people look at this and they say they go back to what David and them did and how they rationalized the thing. They said, well, there isn't any other bread here, and this has been taken off the table anyway, and well, if the young men have kept themselves, they did their little rationalizations as to why it would be all right. They arrived at a judgment as to what they were going to do on that occasion. Jesus says what they did was not lawful. Hey, I'm not going to argue with his interpretation of it. The law is explicit. They shouldn't have done it. Listen, though, to what he says. Listen to what he did. He entered the house of God, ate the showbread that was not lawful for him to eat, neither but for them that were with him, but only for the priest. You can't do that. Don't we all understand that? And yet nobody blamed David for what he did. But they blamed Jesus' disciples. Then he said this, "Haven't you read in the law how on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Now, you want to think about that one for a while. That will also, cross your eyes. Because really, normally, wouldn't you say that the greater law would prevail over the lesser law? And there's no greater law than the Ten Commandments, is there? And yet what happens here is, he says the priests, in the process of doing the work of killing an animal, cutting the animal up, throwing the big pieces up on the altar to be burnt, spreading the meat around, doing the things that they had to do, which was work. And it was more than those guys were doing walking through the fields of grain, I'll guarantee you. He said they profane. He didn't say they appear to profane. He said they profane the Sabbath in the temple and are blameless. No blameless ends to them. Now, this is what I meant when I said this has got to drive legalists crazy. Because the law is absolutely explicit. You're not to do that kind of work. the law is also absolutely explicit that the priests were to do that kind of work. How do you handle that? Well, the greater law supersedes the lesser law, doesn't it? And who would have ever imagined that the sacrificial law would be the greater law? What is, I think, oftentimes not understood is that the sacrifices and the ceremonies performed in the temple were the work of God, in the same way that what I do when I go into a radio studio today and talk about the sacrifice of Christ is the work of God. I say a work of God, not the work. I don't want to confuse people. You see what I'm driving at? That on the stage of the temple, they acted out the plan of God before the people. They were proclaiming God, His plan, His mercy, His forgiveness, and all these things were done in the temple on the Sabbath day because it was God's work, not theirs, that they were doing. And yet Jesus said they profaned the Sabbath and were blameless. Now, how is all this possible? It's possible because it's not the purpose of the law to condemn. The purpose of the law is not to be shackles and chains. It's to be a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. When we break the law breaks us. It doesn't require God flipping some switches and causing bad things to happen to you. The breaking of the law is bad for us. And the person who is a man of God, who does his best to make his decisions according to the law of God, takes them into account, weighs things in a balance, and acts to please God in what he does, is going to be all right because of God's mercy. That there are some times when you're going to find two laws that come into conflict. Jesus just told us one. He said, I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. If you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day.